All right, class. So welcome to lesson 4.2, module 4, lesson 2. We continue our discussion of social class. Now, in this lesson, we're going to get into additional detail, and you'll see how our definitions, our concepts for studying social class will change. So first thing is, let's read and annotate reading 4.3. Again, we'll annotate with hypotheses. Make sure you're logged in, right? And the hypothesis, and make sure you have selected group POL 100 in order to annotate your comments in a way that everybody else in the class will be able to see. Now, this reading, Capital and Labor, sets up some specific concepts and ideas that we need to be aware of, which will make our understanding of social class more sophisticated and thus ultimately more useful compared to the first two readings that we did in lesson 4.1. Okay, so right off the bat, we have this distinction between capital and labor. So as you read and annotate this, pay attention to what is the difference between capital and labor. And of course, at the very beginning of this reading, we have this definition of what do we call wealthy people, individuals or families? Well, we call them, Parenti says, the owning class. And we have to be very clear on how he defines the owning class. Owning class is not just people who have a lot of money, but we got to be more specific than that. And notice how here, the owning class are people who are defined as anyone who live mostly off of investments. And here are some examples of investments. Okay, so the wealthy class, eventually we're going to call those people capital owning, wealth owning, capitalist class, are people who are not just people who have high income. They may have very low income, but they own wealth because they own certain things that are very valuable in society, and it enables them to live without actually having to sell their ability to work to somebody else for a salary. They don't need salaries because they can live off of their investments, their wealth, essentially. And of course, the laborers, the workers, are people who live mostly off of their salaries, right? So this is a basic distinction that you have to be clear, that makes the discussion of social class much more precise and actually meaningful. The big difference between two major social classes of America is Americans who are owners of wealth. They own things that are wealth giving, like real estate, right? If you own a house that you can rent, or a building or buildings that you rent to others, then you are wealthy because the amount of money that you will get every month from renting your 35 apartments is a lot. You know, it's obviously way more than you can spend. You don't need to work then in order to be able to live, because the rental income that you're going to get from owning an apartment building in New York City is going to be enough for you to live in a certain way that is very different from the class of people who don't own any wealth. They rent their apartments that they live in, or they have a mortgage on the house that they live in, and thus they have to do something else in order to make a living. And that's why that other group of people is called a different social class, the non-wealthy. So we're going to start avoiding words like middle, upper middle class, because they're not really meaningful. It's much more meaningful to talk about social class in terms of wealth or lack of wealth. So this is what this meaning gets into, what this reading gets into. Other important things here that I'm asking you to pay attention to is the concept of surplus value. Okay, what is that surplus value? What are we talking about here? Also, Adam Smith's definition of what we're going to call labor theory of value, which is a quote that is discussed by Parenti here. This is Adam's labor theory of value. So think about what that means by studying this passage here. So this reading basically is about making these basic distinctions between wealth and labor. Okay, these are connected ideas, and they give us the background which divide America into two different main social classes, those who own wealth and those who do not own wealth. Those who do not own wealth have to basically sell their ability to work to make something that is valuable to those who own the places of business, for example. After that, head over to the self-assessment, which is going to ask you some key questions related to this reading, which you can complete as a way of reviewing the reading. Then there's the second reading in lesson 4.2, which is read and annotate 4.4, class rules everything around me. This is a longer reading, very important to work through this slowly. And because the discussion question is going to ask you to focus on a lot of these questions discussed in these readings. So just to scroll at the beginning, this reading basically makes the point that social class is a very fundamentally important way to look at American politics, and it makes the case why class is different from identity, such as gender or race. Okay, so all three are important parts of American politics, but class is different from an identity. And here, just to connect our conversation of ideology, this reading makes the point that liberal ideology thinks of social class as just another type of an identity, like somebody's racial identity or ethnicity or gender or sexuality. And this reading makes the point that actually class is not really an identity. It's something else. It's some other part of who we are. It's our class, right? It's not an identity the way liberals talk about it. And the way liberals talk about class is not very helpful. And this reading makes the case for it. So I think it's an important argument to be aware of. Okay, so after you go through this reading, self-assessment, think about the following three questions, and I give you page numbers to focus your study, and then we go to our discussion board for this module, for this lesson, 4.2. And here we have 4 questions. Question 1, what is the difference between owners and employers? I already started making that distinction, but in your comments, question 1, tell us what is the distinction in your own words between owners and employers. Give an example of each, an employer, an owner, and a worker. Sorry, I made a mistake here, which I'm going to fix. It should say the difference between owners and employees. Okay. Then the second question is asking you to comment on the Adam Smith quote from page 28 of reading 4.3. What is it saying about labor? Okay. Then question 3 and 4 shift to reading 4.4. What are your thoughts on the main argument that class is not an identity? So first of all, do you know what the argument is? So make sure you're clear on the argument of why class is not an identity. And second of all, do you agree with that, or or you disagree with it? What are your thoughts on the argument that class should not be approached as an identity, like race, for example? Lastly, question 4. How do you understand the argument that reading 4.4 makes when stating that, quote, class structures are built around a close form of dependency? This word dependency. What is this close form of dependency, and can you think of an example? I'll give you a hint. It has to do with the relationship between a worker and the boss, or the worker and the owners of the company. The relationship between a Starbucks barista who goes to work for Starbucks Corporation and makes the drinks that then are sold to the customers of Starbucks. What's the relationship between that barista and the owners of Starbucks? Okay, this is asking you to think about the relationship, questions about labor, questions about what happens. Why is it that working class people need a job to begin with, and where do they get the job? Where do they go to work, or who do they work for, and why do they have to work for those people, right? And so it sets up this important conversation. Lastly, last thing for module 4 is your response paper. And these are basically short essays. Okay, 2 questions. 1, reading 4.4 makes the point that capitalists and workers, in other words, wealthy people and people who do not own wealth, workers, pursue different strategies in living their lives. Why? Because we have different interests. The interests of a billionaire or a millionaire like Donald Trump are very different than the interests of you and me. Why is this true? Why is it true that different social classes have different interests in everyday life? In what way are these interests of the workers and the wealth owners different? Give an example. So here's an example to think about. Think about yourself. You as a student at CUNY, the City University of New York, typical New Yorker, let's say a typical CUNY student is a working class person who needs a job in order to survive. What are the specific interests and things that are important to you as a worker, as a working class person who's not wealthy? What do you care about? What is important to you in terms of New York City everyday life? I'll give you a hint. For me, the MTA is very important. If the MTA became even worse than it is right now, my life is going to be even more miserable in terms of my commute to work, either because it's too slow, it's too expensive. What happens if it becomes totally unaffordable to take the subway? Because the fare keeps going up every year, but salaries are not. Or at least they're not going up as fast as the fare increase. What might be the interest of a wealthy person, a real estate mogul who owns 35 buildings in Manhattan? What might he or she care about? What might be the priorities that he or she's concerned about? Right? So this question just asks the right about understanding. Do you understand that different social classes have different interests because of the social class that they belong to? Somebody who's wealthy cares about things that are different from somebody who is a worker. Question 2, explain how the following statement from reading 4.4 might be accurate in describing American politics. Since most people in society are independents to capitalists, to the wealthy, this means that other forms of oppression in society are also connected to class power. So in other words, does it make sense to you or not to say that racism is connected to the fact that we have a social class structure between rich and poor? So think about these things, and once you finish answering them on Microsoft Word or Google Docs or whatever, upload your answers via this form. Alrighty, and that's basically it for this module.